I'm David Morse from Atlantic Philanthropies, which is otherwise known as the Incredible Shrinking Foundation. We are poised to make our last grant, Chris, in 323 days is the end of the year. Sometime, but who's counting? Sometime in by the end of 2016. But we're not here to talk about Atlantic. We are here to talk about and learn about the intersection of philanthropy and government and public policy and strategic communications. And so we know there are probably four ways that you can think about, big ways you can think about this intersection. Sometimes it's here, sometimes it's here, sometimes it's here, and sometimes it's here. And sometimes it's all of the above simultaneously. We have a great group of panelists, and we're going to start with Rashad talking about some examples from ColorOfChange as to engagement, disengagement, connection, advocacy, activism. And Rashad, I know, has some particular insights in sort of the intersection of all of those things. Mm-hmm. So, Rashad, please.
Great. Well, thank you. And depending on your perspective, we could have been in any one of those, any one of those sort of areas. The story I'm going to talk about is a story from our work around ALEC, which from our perspective really started as a fight back campaign to push back against an organization that is well known to many folks who work in the states, that advances a lot of legislation that was detrimental to our organization's mission and to the communities we represent at ColorOfChange. We are a civil rights organization that uses technology to advance the cause of our members, Black folks and their allies of all races. We're the largest online civil rights organization with 1.3 million members around the country. And we learned about ALEC as we got a deeper relationship with ALEC as we were trying to figure out how to push back against discriminatory voter ID laws that were popping up around the country. The Brennan Center had done a great report about 5 million folks, disproportionately Black, being prevented from reaching the polls. And we started figuring out how we were going to push back. And we started behind-the-scenes communication with corporations that were funding ALEC. And so we didn't start with the state legislators who were part of ALEC, and we didn't start with sort of state houses. We started with corporations because we found out that 98% of ALEC's funded came from corporations. So this is also in the place of how corporate America, how government interacts with government to create environments that can be hostile to poor communities of color. And so we started behind-the-scenes communications. Back and forth, they would say things to us like, we give money to the left and we give money to the right, and we would say, that's great, but there's not really two sides to Black people voting. And after a while of that back and forth, we got to the place where we had to go public. And so we started what was a public campaign on a set of corporations that we had spent months going back and forth with, trying to communicate to them about discriminatory voter ID laws. It was also in the midst of the Trayvon Martin tragedy in Sanford, Florida. And what had happened was our members were mobilized around fighting back for Trayvon. We were supporting hoodie rallies around the country, registering people to vote. And we had sort of this ongoing communications with state legislators on the progressive side who were trying to figure out how to fight back against ALEC as many pieces of legislation were moving in state houses that were really dealing with the role of government to be able to be a regulator, the role of government to be able to hold the line and support issues that support communities. So to the extent that this was really a story about strategic communications, was that we started to go out public on corporations, and we would give them a couple of hours to decide whether or not they were going to leave ALEC. We would show them what the website was going to look like, and then we would start both in the media and through mobilizing our members to make phone calls, showing up to rallies, all those things. But underneath all of this was an embedded message that we kept going going out to both our members and the larger media about the role of government, the importance of government being a regulator. And as we sort of continue to see the fruits of that, as we're sort of instantly be able to trigger our members, even as they see in popular culture, even as they see through the news how government is attacked, whether it's government workers sort of being made the butt of jokes in our popular culture, whether it's government and the conversations about the role of government being pushed back on. We're seeing the fruits of our labor around the ALEC campaign and our work around Flint and our work around climate change and our work around many areas where government's role as regulators, government's role at holding the line in terms of what's acceptable and not acceptable, and government's role in lifting up those that have been marginalized. Our ability to be able to instantly sort of move our members because we did the work in sort of a fight back moment when people needed to fight back against something that was problematic. Just to close out about our ALEC campaign, which was incredibly successful, the corporations that we sort of went back and forth with, they didn't want to actually stay part of ALEC. An organized constituency was incredibly important. Over 100 corporations have now left ALEC. We created a real domino effect in terms of that. They ended their committees that worked on issues like Stand Your Ground and voter ID. We left them with about a $1.5 million budget shortfall. We were able to use that opening on ALEC to fight and win on issues like municipal broadband in the South, in Georgia, in the Georgia State House, and other places where we didn't think it was actually possible a year earlier, but we're able to use the openings around ALEC because those were ALEC bills. And then they had to close down their swanky DC offices and move to Virginia.
Judy, you've got a perspective, you've got multiple perspectives, from the perspective of now a CEO, of an advisor, of the head of a corporate foundation as well. I don't know if your corporate foundation was lobbied by ColorOfChange, probably not. You're probably way more progressive than that. But can you tell us a little bit about your experience and at the intersection and
Sure.
what some of the promising ideas might be?
First of all, good morning. I feel better than I sound, so sorry about that. I can't hear very well, and so those of you who I know well, I won't give you a big hug. I am so pleased to see this topic on the schedule, and I'm really curious when we get into the Q&A, because I'm hoping we can have a conversation, that I'm curious as to why, because there's so many other good panels that we are competing against, why this has drawn you here. I always think that it's really important for you to know what my biases are, to kind of to frame, because I have some very strong feelings about communication and how it plays out really in everything we do. First of all, communications to me is as basic as the air you breathe. You really can't do very much well without communicating. And if you think about the most effective leaders that you know, they are really good communicators. So it really starts also with individual. Organizations that you admire probably do a decent job in terms of communicating. Issues or feelings that motivate you, because I'm a strong belief that the arts is a form of communication, and one that I think we ought to be using more in terms of moving forward. That's really communication. I mean, if you've ever worked for a boss that was not a good communicator, you know it even has a role in terms of your productivity. You're going to decide today whether or not this panel, whether this conference met your standards, partly because of communication. So we feel the pressure here, believe me. I was a communications professional before I was a philanthropic professional. When I left college, I didn't know anything except about what I wanted to do was that I wanted to, one, serve, find a way to make money and serve, and also to help tell stories that would move folks. So I'm always looking for stories. This job, I've been CEO almost, believe it or not, 2 years. It's like, whoa, time went by. And I've had to really rethink issues about communications. I'm that person now that goes into the employee lounge and folks stop talking when I arrive. I am finding myself having to really communicate over and over again and remind myself that, you know, when you're changing culture, when you want to change behavior, whether in an organization or outside of the organization, you got to use every kind of communication tool that you have. And I certainly have tried in terms of, you know, individual meetings, really looking at ways we tell the story to our board and how we represent the organization outside. So Friday nights, I'm dead because I'm communicating nonstop. I remember this phrase, someone says, you know you're getting old when on Saturday night the phone rings and you hope it's not for you. And that's how it went. But the other thing I realized in this job, communication is 24/7, because usually while I'm squeezing oranges and cantaloupes, there is someone who comes up to me and says, you're Judy Belk with the California Wellness Foundation. Let me tell you about a grant, or I saw you participate. So it's a never ending, and that's part of the role in terms of leadership. So that's one about everything, and that's how I see the world in terms of communication. Second is someone who's worked in government, worked in the corporate sector, worked for a social enterprise, newbie with Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors, and now heading this. It's uneven in terms of communication, in terms of how well. I mean, government, unevenness, corporate, all of us have. But let's talk about philanthropy. The good news is this is an amazing time to be talking and thinking about communication in the philanthropic sector. I don't think you have to, it's a hard sell for most CEOs or most boards to invest in communication. So that's the good news. At Cal Wellness, we were one of the first in 1996. We were one of the first large foundations to invest in a professional community communications function. And at that time, the goal was to help tell the stories of our grantees. That has totally shifted now. As I talk to our grantees, they're saying, well, you know what, we can tell our own stories. And usually they do it in a much better way than we do. We could learn a lot. What I've heard as I've traveled this state is from policy leaders and from grantees, we'd like to kind of hear your voice. We don't want you to get ahead of us, but we'd like you to stand with you. What's your point of view? So I think it's really shifting. The other issue is, again, internal. I see, in most cases, communications being here, programming being here. These are the folks where we need a press release, it's a crisis, we need, you know, an annual report, which I really question, does anyone need an annual report anymore? And so I gotta stop. So I would say, and what I'm interested in terms of engaging, it's a really good time. How do we we're in a sector that most folks don't still understand what we do in terms of policy leaders. We're uneven in how we do the job, and clearly I have more to say, but I'm going to honor the yellow card and get some water. So I'll turn it over to Kristen.
So, Kristen, you've got the perspective of an advisor to NGOs, to advocacy organizations, and to funders. From your own experience on one or two issues, how are we as funders doing? How are we as funders helping you do what you do better? And how can we do better in making that happen?
I have had the privilege of working for everybody on this panel, and I see philanthropy as a pressure on government. And sometimes it's a really positive pressure, like they have models that they are trying to get government to adopt, and it's really nice, and you are giving them something, generally for free, and that's really nice, and that's where David was talking about this. It's also a negative pressure point, and philanthropy plays a very important role there of putting up grantees who are going to put up that negative pressure point where there's going to be constituencies who say, this is a very, very, very serious problem. Like, we're seeing some of the best philanthropic work right now in Flint. I hope it maintains, but I'm proud of what's going on there right now. I'm going to talk about two pressure points that I think are interesting and illustrative of how philanthropies can be thinking about this. One is a total upside and one is a cautionary tale. So I'll start with net neutrality, which you're going to think like, oh, I'm going to tell you about how that's the worst name ever. That's not actually the problem with the campaign, but it was the worst name ever, net neutrality. But a lot of foundations got behind this quite early, the Ford Foundation, Open Society Foundation, Media and Democracy Fund, Mozilla, and they put a lot of money behind grantees quite early. And what was interesting about it is when they first came on the scene, they were telling government that they needed to regulate something that no one actually saw was a problem. So, I mean, government doesn't like to regulate when you've shown it is a huge problem. So the idea of, like, they were going to regulate before the problem actually happened, like proactive problem solving, like, yeah, that's not the government. So really interesting, though, Ford and others really did put a lot of energy and effort behind grantees and tell them, hey, you need to get out there really early and message this net neutrality thing because, A, it's the worst name ever. Have I mentioned that? And we really have to define what it is and why it's important. And the fact that it was an open, free internet and it really mattered became just this thing that a lot of people started to know about, including people like Barack Obama, who by the time he was president actually signaled that he was for net neutrality. And this is a critical moment in a strategic communication effort that philanthropy helped to support with a lot of grantees, is that they've actually signaled it's important, which means change is possible, which by no means makes it determined that it's going to happen, but it could happen, which is exciting. The second thing is that I think that the philanthropies really did anticipate where some of the big vulnerabilities were going to be. And the biggest was going to be that if we in fact started moving regulation, we knew what was going to happen, people were going to say it's bad for business. And if it ended up being public interest versus business, we were going to lose. We've seen that fight a lot. We don't have to have that fight again. And so again, they had grantees who were really very good at mobilizing the business voice, so that by the time actually regulation started to move and business came out just like we knew they would and said it's bad for business, Netflix actually came out and said, well, not so much for us. It was actually great for us. And it actually helped us, too, that they recruited companies like Netflix and Etsy, because the truth is another vulnerability which we did not anticipate from opposition was that they were going to say, we have to reclassify. That was our solution to net neutrality. You're like, really? Could it get worse, Kristen? No, it couldn't. We're going to reclassify was our other big message point. And the interesting thing about it was they tried to say this is very old-timey. It's like telephones. Everybody had to have a telephone. This is old-timey stuff. But again, Netflix and these companies that were born online, basically, were saying it was really critically important. So it really helped in that. And the third really important thing that they did was they realized that inevitably, if you really want to win something, you have to have purpose, power, and people. And so at this point, we had purpose. We knew what we wanted, net neutrality and reclassification. We had power because we had actually amassed quite a number of interesting people, the president being one, businesses being another. But we actually needed people. And suddenly you're like, so let's go out and get a lot of people to write to the FCC. Now, I don't know if you've actually tried to get someone to write their congressperson, but like a really arcane federal agency, like, are you kidding me? Anyways, but people like Rashad are like, no problem. I don't know how that happens. But again, the philanthropies went out. They found folks who could really mobilize constituencies that had an incredibly important voice to this, like the next generation civil rights groups. And the next thing you know, those folks moved incredibly nimbly. And by the time we had to go to the FCC, they generated 4 million comments to the FCC. So in case the government was looking for that political cover they needed to take a very aggressive action, they were able to do it. So I would just say, to me, this was like philanthropy working very closely with very good grantees in the field and really understanding and just looking at a mountain, going uphill the whole way and doing it. Let me turn quickly to the Common Core, which I got involved in late. And to me, it was going on the downside of the mountain. By the time I got involved, it was passed in a bunch of states. They had made these backroom deals with a bunch of governors. It came from the states. The governors created it. Who doesn't like standards? How bad could this be? Whew. Well, let me tell you how bad it was. So I think we're on the downhill slide. And suddenly, by the time basically, in this case, Philanthropies and some key grantees were able to do these behind-the-scenes deals with government, which you would think, wow, that's really efficient. Behind the scenes, they kind of did it under the radar. And by the time they opened the doors and they were like, ta-da, we've completely changed the education system, they were sort of shocked by a bunch of people were like, what? So like the amount of opposition that came to something that you would think was about to be the law of the land was incredibly intense and unanticipated. And I would say a couple of lessons to learn from that, which issues you're probably funding could face too. The first is that originally it started with, it was the governors and it was very bipartisan. But as soon as any backlash started, a bunch of the champions backed off. And in this case, the champions happened to be on the conservative side. So suddenly, this came to the second problem, which it gave rise to a fake narrative shift. And so suddenly, it wasn't from the states with governors and bipartisan. It was out of Washington, and it was Obamacare. And suddenly, you're having to fight an entire, like a myth, an origin myth that's not even true. Which was really, really, really tough. And then the third thing is you suddenly realize that as people are really angry and wanting to hear more, and this is the thing I would say about those behind-room deals with no strategic communication happening and giving that meaning to what is the Common Core and why is it good for kids and why is it good for our nation, is that people have a void, and all they know is suddenly everything changed. They don't know what it means. Now there's a fake narrative filling that void, and it's very sticky. So that's a problem. And so now what you have is you're dealing with departments of eds are now on the front lines. Well, nobody was helping the Department of Eds, right? So these people who are used to like doing the school menu lunch, that was their communication, were suddenly having to answer really complex questions about the Common Core. And so, you know, you had to backfill all that in. And then the other thing, just to realize when you're about to have a really big fight, which it is now turned into, you have to have high-risk activists. And so suddenly, all these behind closed scenes doors, no grassroots, all that missing stuff, it also means that, yes, in polling, teachers and parents prefer the Common Core. We still poll incredibly highly. But that doesn't mean they're going to the community meeting. They don't want to go to that high-risk, super conflict, argumentative culture. They don't want to get on Twitter and have trolls, you know, go after them. The teachers are like, I'm putting my head down, I'm going to do what I'm told to do, you know, I'm trying to teach kids here. So this is just a really interesting cautionary tale to me of like when you're trying to move big social change, mostly you will walk right into, you are going against vested interests and they will come back. And are you ready for that? Because if you win, they're just going to come at you harder because now they've really lost. And look at climate change or anything else and you'll just see how hard people will fight. And philanthropies have to be willing to stand strong in times like that.
So, Kristen, I want to come back to you in terms of that your last point about how you recapture the narrative. But before that, Rashad, you and Kristen both talked mostly about philanthropic support for your organizations as fostering pressure on government or the agents of the agents of government. But you also think that versus deep engagement, but you actually think that's sort of a false dichotomy. Can you sort of explain the nuance and how you think organizationally about this and think about this in terms of your communications?
Absolutely. So yeah, I do think it's a false dichotomy, and I think that sometimes we sometimes we have conversations with funders that will say, well, all you do is create pressure. Like, are you willing to work with other folks on the inside? And I oftentimes say that we have to change the incentive structure before we walk into the room. And so if we're walking into the room without sort of any ability, any leverage, and trying to ask decision makers to make changes without anything on the outside, any type of pressure tactics, then we're actually not communicating or negotiating from a place of power. And so a lot of the pressure that we're either creating or generating is the type of pressure that allows for my organization that serves, marginalized communities to walk into the room with a set of power that incentivizes people at the table to want to work with us. If we are walking into the room saying, hey, we're going to, it's your decision to make, and no matter what decision you want to make, we're going to be fine with it, or we're going to have to deal with it, and we don't have any type of leverage or power on the outside, then we're not going to sort of get the results that our community deserves and our community needs. And so I do think it's a sort of false dichotomy that the work on net neutrality in particular, where Color of Change really served not only as a force mobilizing our members, but a counterweight to interest groups that were taking corporate money and making claims about an open internet that were simply not true. Our ability to have a powerful outside game allowed us to walk into the rooms with the FCC chairman and members of the FCC and have deep conversations about how we could not only get them to do the right thing, but then support them after they did the right thing. How could we, after they came out with positive statements, affirm that publicly? How could we give them the cover in communities to make them not, we knew they were going to get attacked for standing up. How could we make them champions in a certain community? How could we do things that were going to affirm them and maybe send a message to other folks who wanted to come out in support of a net neutrality, saying, hey, this is good territory to be in. History is going to treat you kindly. You may sort of not have the best job when you leave the FCC. You may not be able to walk into the corporations that you thought you would be able to walk into with a job, but we're going to make you a hero. We're going to make sure that the books and the stories that are written about this moment paint you in the right way. And so I do think it's a false dichotomy because there's a difference between having presence and power. And sometimes we mistake having presence, having visibility on an issue for actually having power in the rooms where we need to have power.
It seems to me that with respect to net neutrality, the Spitfire talks about and has a terrific document called Finding the Activation Point. Seems to me that the activation point on net neutrality actually was John Oliver's rant on net neutrality on his program, that really was an incredible accelerator and generator of the kind of activity that you described as, most people find really hard to do, to write to a federal agency about a rulemaking process. Is that the kind of, how do you create that, how does a foundation help you do that? How does an NGO help do that, create that activation point? Because these things just don't happen. They are planned.
Yes, they are very, very, very planned. I mean, I think the biggest thing is just to realize it wasn't just information. It was really persuading people to understand. And in general, like if you look at the activation point on almost anything, the first thing is you absolutely have to make it personal. And that's what we were able to do. And John Oliver certainly did it to people who feel very powerful themselves on the internet, which is when he called them trolls and like, you are so opinionated, why don't you be opinionated about this thing? They just reminded him, like, you have an opinion about this? And they were like, we do have an opinion about this. And a lot of them did have an opinion. So being personal is really important. The second thing is, though, is also hope. We mobilized exactly when we needed to. Like if we had just had them writing the FCC at totally random times, then we wouldn't have gotten the same momentum. But there was a comment period. We were building around a comment period. The groups working on the ground were really working on that. And you give them a great amount of hope that they actually can dictate the outcome of this thing. And these people feel very powerful having done this. And that's just a huge, huge, huge thing. That's not often citizens' interactions with government aren't like that. And I think sometimes in the 24/7 cycle, we act as if we can have influence 24/7, and that is not true. And having these great moments of huge impact and making people feel incredibly powerful, it was a really important thing and key to activating people.
Judy, you've been in multiple roles, both as funder and advisor, and so from your perspective, what do you think that we but you're a relatively new CEO. In this space, what do you think that from your past history and experience, what do you think we can do better in terms of helping our own organizations, but probably more importantly, the organizations that we fund do better in terms of be more effective in terms of their communications? I was really struck by Larry Kramer's comment yesterday at the plenary that says, from the point of view of philanthropy, we don't do anything. We facilitate, we fund, but we're not the people we're not the people on the ground. I've always said for many years that the most overused pronoun in philanthropy is we. We really do, as organizations, rely on those who we are funding and supporting and collaborating with to do the work and do the work effectively. Some of it is, of course, trust, but there are other things that perhaps philanthropy can do to help make those organizations and by inference ourselves better.
Yeah. Good question. I guess there are three observations. One, I've been, as someone who started out in the corporate sector in corporate philanthropy, and then worked for a social enterprise philanthropic advisory firm, and now large. I'm amazed at how segmented the sector is. I have to work really hard in this job to connect and maintain the ties that I had for 11 years with Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors, working with family foundations and working with individual donors, and really working hard. I was 10 years heading up the Levi Strauss Foundation, so I'm a big proponent of the corporate sector. But I even sometimes have to work hard to, sometimes to stay connected with some community foundations or other public charities that's a hybrid. And I think that's a communication issue, and I think it's a missed opportunity also in terms of how we segment the function, the sector. And it's really unfortunate because, as many of you know, the fastest growing segment of the philanthropic sector is not big, community, big private foundations like wellness. It's really, the individual donors, donor advised funds, and family foundations. And so that's an issue that I think we have to deal with. Second is the issue about language and messaging. And this is where, my family back, in Virginia, I'm a Virginia girl, really is helpful. Because, I start talking about convenings and they're saying, what the heck is that? What do you mean, a meeting, whatever, So our messaging is really important. When I came into California Wellness and my team said, our lens is social determinants of health. And I, said, okay, we'll kind of unpack that for me. Well, it's really our belief that where you live, your race, whether or not you have money or not, your zip code, all of that impacts your health and wellness. Okay, I got that. Let's talk about it in that way. We are the largest funder of gun violence prevention in the state and probably one of 3 in the country. And we look at that. 20 plus years ago, we embraced the research, the public health research, which says violence is indeed a public health issue. And that was huge then. I was up in the Bay Area and thinking, oh God, this new foundation has kind of embraced it, but it makes sense. So that is, as we're thinking about over the 20 plus years, weighing in on one of the most controversial issues in America, how we talk about that and who we talk about it. And sometimes our grantees are the ones that can help us. I was just visiting the rural part of the state up in Reddit, and I had a group of grantees and other community leaders, and they all said, we are a gun-owning region, but Judy, we also, it's at least once a week, almost once a week, that we attend a funeral of someone who has committed suicide. So as you're thinking about your messaging, we're not so much hearing that. And in fact, the facts support that. 2 out of 3 victims of gun violence is related to suicide. And whether you own a gun or whether you don't own a gun, that's not a statistic that I think anyone is concerned about. So that was something that, we are now including in, our narrative as we talk about it. Or a police officer, the former chief of police for Emeryville, we had I won't say a convening, we had a meeting, a statewide meeting last week where we brought in folks from various backgrounds. And he said, we own more guns in this country than folks own televisions, and accessibility plays a role. So, and then reminding folks that the federal government cannot use federal dollars to research the impact on gun violence in using CDC dollars. So that's a narrative, it's an emotional issue, but we really are very thoughtful about saying that where is it that we can perhaps find the common ground. So that's one, looking at your narrative and what you say, because most times how we say things, even how we report what we fund, nobody can understand it. And we need to do better. Cal Wellness, we need to do better. It's like, kind of just tell me, what is it that you fund? Is this in? Is this it? Whatever. So pay attention to it. And the third is really big encouragement that you use as many tools that you have. I talked about, the arts. Films like Inconvenient Truth played a huge role in raising awareness around climate change. Waiting for Superman really helped in terms of looking at the issue about educational reform. I'm a big supporter of arts as a social action thing and the work of folks like Anna DeVere Smith. So those are 3 thoughts that I have about how we can work with our grantees, learn from them, and how we can kind of shape communication and messages.
So one last question for each of you, from me for each of you, and then it would be great if we can get into what they call in the House of Commons question time, and have those in the audience ask questions, and then ask questions of what do you want to know from each of us. But the question I have for you, and it goes back to your point about increasing suicide rates in Northern California, is in communications, how much does evidence matter? Funders are, at least large institutional funders, tend to be fairly wonky organizations. We talk about building the evidence and then having the evidence be dispositive in order to create change in policy and practice. But it's not that simple. We all know it's not that simple. And when I was at Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, our standard MO was we would do something like a randomized clinical trial in multiple cities, multiple regions around the country, see what worked, what didn't, then say, here government, this works, here, this is how you could scale up, it's yours to fund or yours to organize and operate. Nurse Family Partnership is probably really a really good example of that. But that was 1970s, 1980s, 1990s. It's now the 2010s, and that doesn't really work anymore. So, Rashad, evidence.
Yeah, this is always a big question that we get as a next generation civil rights organization. We were founded 10 years ago, and so some of the methods and strategies that we're trying to employ, folks want us to ask us for studies or research or tests on that no one's actually funded, and while we've had a real track record of success, I always think about the fact that ColorOfChange actually wouldn't exist if it wasn't for our founder and his wife, funding the organization, self-funding the organization for the first 3 years in their home after Hurricane Katrina for the tune of about $1 million. And had we come with a strategy document saying, wow, this internet thing is great, a lot of people are using it, Move On and all these other organizations are mobilizing folks, there's this type of evidence, that would not have been the type of evidence that foundations at the time would have accepted. And so Color of Change was founded, and 4 years in, the funders came to Color of Change and said, wow, you guys are doing great. There should be Color of Changes for other communities. And so right after that, an organization was founded that founded Presente.org, 18 Million and Rising, Empower now for the Muslim community. And all these organizations have come about as a result of a set of evidence that folks in communities of color can use the internet to mobilize and build power. And being in the participation age, organizing and communications will look a little bit different. But I say that thinking about sort of how do we innovate in these moments? How does Color of Change now take the next step to think about the next set of strategies? How do we have the sort of flexibility to stretch ourselves and think about moving into new spaces? And I think that philanthropy continues to not want to sometimes take the risk with us on those, even as we prove ourselves to be successful. And so I do think that figuring out what actually evidence is evidence that that there's an institution that can innovate and think of new strategies and build them. Is that evidence for continuing to support them? Or is there a set of evidence that we have to look back historically and say, this worked 5 years ago, so now let's go all in, when actually the environment, I always say this about pop culture. Once the New York Times writes something about something's in style, that's about 2 years after it's no longer in style. And oftentimes that can be my experience inside of foundations, that oftentimes folks want to fund something that we've already sort of moved on from, that we have exploited, that we have gotten a lot of success out of, that we have built power out of, and now we are thinking about the next thing. And it's how do we think about the word evidence? And how do we think about combining that with innovation? Because the kind of next fights of our times, the fights that we are going to win and build power for communities and build a type of power that transforms the landscapes that we live in, will not be won just off of the strategies from 5, 10, or 15 years ago, the things that we saw that worked, but the type of risk that we can take in the future that leverages the newest tools of our time.
Well, evidence is really important to us as a public health foundation. It's driven. We're not making this up when we talk about, actually where you live does kind of impact your health and wellness. So that's really important to us. And this is where communication can come in. It's really how you communicate. And I would say the one piece of advice that I would want us all to think about is if we use the lens of communicating our evidence, our strategies, our messages to what I would call the end user, the person, the community that we're trying to impact, I think we would have an entirely different set of languages and use the different vehicles. In other words, if we, which we tried to do last week, brought in the voices of folks whose lives had been drastically changed by gun violence. It was really raw and it was really painful for the audience, but that's who I want to communicate with. We do a lot of work with men and boys of color. Why not have those voices? Unfortunately, most of our communication is very similar to the kind of communication we have at this conference. We're kind of talking to each other. I think we're doing a pretty good job of communicating here, but wouldn't it be a little more interesting to just get someone who we're trying to impact and say, how do you think we're doing? What messages are you getting from philanthropy. I remember when I was on the independent sector board and I went out, the streets of Seattle and went around asking folks, what do you think philanthropy or nonprofit sector? And it was just funny answers. No one really understands. So I would say if there's one thing you can go back and you can do tomorrow, anything that goes out from your organization, anything you want to communicate, it's saying someone who we're trying to impact, do they get it? Do they understand it? And then as you're putting together programs and efforts, try to fight for and get in the voices of the folks that you say we're all here to serve.
I mean, to me, especially around communications, I do just think I really want to focus forward and not back. Not because I don't think we should study what worked and think about it. It's just that I find that the evidence stuff tends to get people to do stuff that's already been done. So, like, the number of people who call me and are like, I want to do something where I put something over someone's head. And, like, I get it. It's the ALS thing. Like, ALS did it. So, like, all they're trying to think about is, okay, we need to get people to stick something else on their head. It's like, that's not the point of that evidence, right? The point of that evidence is to say, okay, so what happened that made ALS so contagious? And the truth is that some of the evidence that came out will help you. Like, people like to be asked by a peer to do something. People like to have a memorable experience. People like to feel like they're part of something bigger, so reporting back to the community that so many people are doing it. Like, those are the things that we can learn and say, now let's create something that does those things, which, by the way, will not involve anything over someone's head. So, but I think that people sort of look at that evidence and are like, I'm going to do it exactly the same, which is not it. And in communication, unlike a lot of other things, like program where you have a solution and, like, that's your solution, and that's going to be your solution for 10 years. But marketing, you can change every day. You can constantly be attuned. Like, if nobody came to this workshop, we wouldn't have kept talking. We would have gone somewhere else, right? And if all of you started to leave, we might actually do something different. And you should be constantly adjusting in your communications. And I think the problem is, especially coming from funders, and David asked me, what do funders do that's wrong? The biggest thing you do that's wrong is you make your grantees think that you have funded a tactic. And that they will do that tactic no matter what feedback they're getting. Yep. So to me, you can just, it's very simple. You need to know, is your communication actually going to an audience? Does it actually reach them? And you can measure that. And then you can know, did it land? Like, did it actually resonate with them? Is there anything that's saying it's resonating with them? Is there any two-way thing starting to happen? Are they showing up at places? Are they getting active online? Are they doing anything? Then you can know, is it motivating them? Are they actually doing what you're asking them to do? And then you can know, is it spreading? And really, that's what you're looking for. And you want them to be as creative and flexible as they can to make that happen. But pretty soon they'll be like, oh, well, they told us to build a website, so we're building a website. And when you go back to the funder will say, that's not true. We just want them to be engaging with people however they need to do that. But for some reason, that message does get out there of, like, you have to do it this way, which is not a good thing.
But sometimes they do just want you to build a website. Even if the website doesn't, yeah.
So because often we want to be able to count widgets.
Yeah.
We want to create, know how many widgets you've created. We want to know how many people you've reached. One of the things that I have learned, because it had to be beaten over my head multiple times from Kristen, is the general public is not your audience. If you're trying to create policy change, the general public is not your audience. Yeah. You have to target your audience. You have to target the messengers. You have to target the campaign that you're engaging in.
Good morning. My name is Nadia. I'm a student at USC in the Master of Nonprofit Leadership and Management program. And I just have a question for how technology and the grants application works for nonprofit organizations who are looking to apply for a grant. And like how does an organization communicate its narrative or its message in a way that really shows the foundation, the impact that it's making? Because sometimes numbers only can get like the surface level of what the organization is doing. Like, for example, in an arts organization, how do you truly communicate that without like video or something like that? If the grant application does not allow you to post video, like how are foundations using technology to better get the narrative of their grantees?
We give out about $35 million a year, and it's small pittance regarding kind of the issues we have. So like most foundations, we say no more than we say yes, and it's always really painful. But you're right in realizing that the grant, what a foundation says and says it wants to do, that's a communication, and I think we do it as a sector so-so. I mean, if I wasn't, in the sector, I would say, well, what does that really mean? And I have to say that nonprofits are pretty uneven in telling their story. In my past life, when I worked at Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors, I worked really hard in working with family foundations and individual donors to get them to come or bring in nonprofits to tell their story. And that was a big deal if I could get individual donors out to the community or whatever. And 9 times out of 10, when I could get them together, the nonprofit could not articulate the story in a really compelling way. And we don't always make it easy because we do have boxes that you have to fill out or whatever. We try. I mean, at Wellness, if we don't fund new organizations unless we go out and meet, because you get a whole different sense of it. We invest a lot in nonprofit capacity building, so there's a level playing field. But really, in the end, someone, and it's usually my terrific program team, they have to make a call and make a decision, and they're often making the decision about the story that's being shared and other things. We talk to other folks or what have you, but it's a communication effort, and there's work needed on both sides.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of a good metaphor for foundations in the process of introducing ideas or introducing organizations or people to a funder. And I guess we're a little like the magic 8-ball. You turn it and you say, try again later, or maybe, or not quite. And if you're at the point at which, frankly, you have to tell your story and make your case to a foundation, you're actually sort of, to continue the metaphor, you're a little behind the 8-ball. Because what you want is you want to be able to call the attention of the organization to you rather than you calling it to the organization. I'll give you the example of Rashad and ColorOfChange with respect at least to Atlantic Philanthropies. ColorOfChange wasn't a grantee until about a year ago. Steve McConnell, who was the head of our U.S. programs, and I came to a forum on voting rights at the Ford Foundation and met Rashad and said, this is an organization that we ought to be behind because the values and the objectives and the work that it's doing is so congruent with what we're trying to do in the space of race and justice. So I guess the way of saying that to you is stand out and make sure you're in the right space so that you and your organization can come to the attention of the funder. Funders don't always play well in the same sandbox. As you know from those of you who are grantees, reporting requirements are different, expectations are different, time frames are different, dollar levels are different. There are all kinds of differences that each funder has a unique perspective on what you do, and you have to respond to that perspective. But actually here, particularly in Southern California, I think there's extraordinary alignment among the funding organizations, and I think it may not be unique, but it is distinctive, I think, across the U.S. So there's some magic here, and whether it's the USC Center and or it's something else that sort of brings that together, but you need that magnet, that glue, that the individual institutions and the individual organizations typically don't. They don't leave their hats at the door, and there needs to be more of that, in my estimation, anyway.
We have a 501c4 and a C3 and a political action committee, and so that's also incredibly important for our ability to be able to play authentically in the cycle and to be able to not have to not have stopping points that are not authentic for our members' experience and their engagement. If something is being said, we have colleagues in the field that right now can't talk about Donald Trump's comments the way they might like to talk about Donald Trump's comments because now he's a political candidate. And so now there sort of is a stopping point. And so I think that also is sort of a piece about context that I think is incredibly important given sort of this, the political cycle, the moment that we're in. I think for us, we're very clear about sort of the kind of disruption points at which Color of Change is most effective, and we sort of have identified a couple of areas. So we play sort of on both sides of this sort of kind of arc that we think of. One side is on opportunistic campaigns where we're taking on sort of fights that help us animate and communicate around larger points. If we win them, they're isolated victories. They are not systemic, but they allow us to create a larger narrative and particularly on-ramp new people onto an issue or on-ramp people hopefully towards long-term systemic fights. So it's, whether it's identifying moments of police violence, right? If you win those moments of getting a conviction, you're not actually changing the systemic nature of police violence. And in fact, like if that's all you're doing, you're playing sort of whack-a-mole, that game you're like, and you'll never actually effectively use the resources that you're raising to see any type of long-term effect. But you pick the right moments, right? Because people are animated in those moments and you can on-ramp people. And if you build the type of momentum and the right narrative, then you leverage that narrative for systemic change. So we intersect there sort of from a communications perspective, in between sort of what producers inside of the media are thinking and what the vehicles in which media producers are producing media. So the content that ends up, whether it's in Hollywood or the content that ends up on our screens, around the news channels. And we do that in many sort of different ways. We run campaigns against so-called experts. We run campaigns around content. We, do all that. And then on the systemic side, where we're actually trying to change standards and practices, whether those are the institutional standards and practices inside of media outlets around what content will show, what their rules are, what the rules of the road are, or whether that's actual laws in policy. And so we're thinking about those long-term and oftentimes that involves a different set of campaigns. Sometimes that involves us either leveraging or identifying original research, finding sort of strategic insights inside of that research that are like the points that, we work a lot with folks like Demos and the Center for American Progress and institutions that create a lot of research. There could be one page in that research, right, that is now the salient point that could drive home and activate and animate folks. And it's understanding that like someone's great research report is not going to be what people are going to read, but a particular point out of that research that we can then leverage by creating infographics or other things are points. And so all that to say for us is that we are very clear about the ways in which we communicate and what we're actually trying to achieve through our communications, and what we're not trying to achieve. And we are very clear with our members as well, so that as we're communicating with them and asking them to engage against a particular political target or mobilize, we're trying to politically educate them around the process so that we're not confusing them about what a victory on something actually would achieve and why that's important. I hope I answered the question.
Yeah. And I would just, add a couple of things, and it really goes to what both Rashad and Kristen have said, is that you have to be nimble. And I would say the other thing is credibility. And I'll give you a perfect example. We're a major funder with government, with other foundations, with community activists in making California a real success story around the Affordable Care Act. And we will continue. But we also thought, with the excitement of the Affordable Care Act, we had to raise our voice about those who have left behind, those in the state that because of their immigration status are not being served. So it provided us an opportunity. We had credibility because we've been working on access for many times. Part of our value, which we say over and over again, one's immigration status should not impact whether or not they have health care, as far as we're concerned, is a human right. The other example, again, going back to gun violence, we were devastated, as much of the world was, over the San Bernardino tragedy. And we felt we had credibility, one, to really talk about that issue, but also use it to educate. That essentially, 1% or less than 1% of gun violence victims are as a result of mass shootings. And I think the president said it best when he said every day in Chicago almost there is a life lost. So we saw it as an opportunity. We had credibility in the issue. When the headlines go away, we are going to still be working with our community partners in terms of making it. And then the other issue, we really believe in this country in terms of the values of the democratic principles. And one is we believe that folks should vote. And so we fund organizations that support civic engagement, to raise the voices. So why wouldn't we be more interested in supporting those organizations as we go into what we think a very critical election? And so there's a lot of room for us. Obviously, we can't take a position on a piece of legislation or a candidate, but we can. We don't, work in a closed system. We got to pay attention to what's happening. And then I would say, do you have a credible role to play? Like we're of course concerned, interested about climate change, but that's not an area that we've done a lot of work in. So I say, look at what's credible and look at what's timing to craft your message.
So in this environment, increasingly anti-wealth, great focus on the upper 1%, huge piles of money influencing, not just on the left and not just on the right, and a resistance to that. What is the role of communications that can connect wealth to a broader foundational authenticity than it currently has?
We spend a lot of time communicating about the role of tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans, the role that corporate power plays, and we've made a number of decisions in terms of even how we engage in our fundraising that allows us to run a certain set of campaigns. So we don't take any big corporate money. We're the only national black civil rights organization in the country that doesn't take big corporate money. We've made that decision because it allows us to run a set of campaigns that we otherwise probably wouldn't be able to run, and to actually sit ourselves inside of a political narrative that is authentic to our members and to engage them in ways that are authentic. And that said, we take money from a lot of big foundations that at times would have been corporations, or the money would have been corporations that we currently don't take money from. And so sometimes we do have to communicate those. We've actually spent a lot of time also as an organization, from just our thought leadership perspective, communicating with the next generation of young, wealthy, largely white donors, spending time communicating with folks with resource generation and other folks about their role as largely folks who have been inheritors of wealth. And they have spent a lot of time communicating with their membership around racial justice issues, particularly in this time we are in, around deep conversations about both immigration reform and Black Lives Matter. And so we've tried to use our the thought leadership side of our work to do education work around the role of the next generation. And I've also spent time, and just earlier this week I did the Black History Month talk at Facebook. Our time as an organization that works very closely with technology to start communicating with the next generation of people really growing wealth around their role, a population that's largely aligning itself with libertarian politics, around sort of the set of injustices that exist in our society that won't be solved simply by sort of data or algorithms.
This notion is one that waxes and wanes over the course of time and history. A lot of concern now about the Zuckerberg gift and whether that is corporate aggrandizement or whether it is or whether it's beneficent. A lot of critique within the foundation, the community of foundations, that why isn't he and his wife establishing a private foundation as opposed to an LLC? The same could have been said for the founder of Atlantic Philanthropies, Chuck Feeney, who created Atlantic as an offshore financial vehicle for a variety of reasons. Got no tax benefit from that, but also was able to operate under the radar. I guess I'll use the comment that Larry Kramer made yesterday as well, is that we should take advantage of our lack of accountability. And there is something about the use of wealth, and we ought to be, but we shouldn't criticize those on the other side of the ideological spectrum for doing the same.
Yeah. The only thing I would say is, because I've thought a lot about it, talk about both on an institutional level and a personal level. In general, I'm humbled by the generosity of not only Americans, but folks around the world. I think giving is in our DNA. So my sense is, and what I've spent most of my life is, for those who want to give, how can they do it in a thoughtful and an effective way? And there are just so many examples, not only of the generosity of folks like the Rockefeller family, the Haas family, but I worked for Target stores, which was related to the Dayton family, making a personal commitment of giving 5% of their personal wealth, and then taking that to the marketplace. And then I have to say, my life has been so enhanced personally by really smart, thoughtful, courageous philanthropy. I grew up in Virginia at a time when folks who looked like me could not go to the public schools, and it was a group of local philanthropists, primarily in the Jewish community, that joined with Legal Defense Fund to get, my sister and I into a public school. And it took also public policy, the Brown decision, but I went to college as a result of a philanthropic gift. My first professional theater experience was because of a gift of a personal philanthropist. So I see more good, I think, if anything, wanting that our role in philanthropy, or concerned about philanthropy, how can we help folks be more thoughtful, be more strategic? I don't think there's anything wrong with money and power. It's how you use it.
Yep.
I do think one of the most important things that philanthropy can realize is how important strategic communications is. And I think that Frank is a conference for Frank, who helped to professionalize public interest. But it's just amazing for the fights that we have to fight. And you think about how many Rashads it's going to take for us to win these fights. It's tremendous. And so I would say that trying to fund programs where we're bringing in especially diverse young people into the field of public interest communications is going to be a really critical function. So this isn't always going to be the intern who's at that nonprofit, but truly like people seeing a career path up. Because right now a lot of our diverse young people who are very interested in communication will only go into corporate America for a variety of reasons, mostly because that's where the career path is. And we actually need people who are at the very forefront of technology, who are going to actually be the people who get Judy to actually accept videos as part of her grant application. So I will say that I do think that that's a very important thing that philanthropy can do, is to realize that this is a real professional field, and we need a lot more people coming into it if we want to win these big, huge social change fights, which we've discussed require incredibly sophisticated communication.
Thanks, and thank you.